Chapter 4. What Makes a Monster? They move to the small room in the back, mostly full of boxes of storage, chests of supplies, and Phil keeps watch with Techno trying on different clothes. Clean, new clothes. And while it's wonderful for Techno to finally have something that isn't just rags from the nether, it's still a bit of a pain. Because the first shirt they try doesn't quite fit, too long past the arms. But Techno refuses to take it off, getting attached to the first thing that's an upgrade from his old clothes. He nearly whines when Phil tugs the shirt off, and he sits on the floor with an angry look, upset that his soft fabric has been taken away. However, he does raise his head when Phil raises up another option. Phil has to coax him with a promise of a gold coin to be patient, and he tells Techno about clothes needing to actually fit, not just be soft. And while Phil gets narrowed eyes and a frown in response, Techno listens. He's still upset whenever Phil swaps out a new shirt, though, and so Phil tries to keep the options short. Emmy eyes Techno the entire time they try outfits on, hesitant and wary, as if any second from now Techno will snap and murder both her and Phil. She walks over with a pair of shoes, places them at Phil's side, then quickly walks off. Eyes still wary, still staring. Techno doesn't seem to notice, too entranced with the next shirt Phil's tugged over his head, and he grips a gold coin in his tiny hand as he wraps his arms around himself, enjoying the change in fabric, looking up at Phil as if asking if this one suffices. It doesn't, it's too small. And Techno hits his head against Phil's arm when Phil goes to tug it off again. Phil only laughs. They settle on a pair of black shorts, falling just over his knees, and a nice long-sleeved white shirt. Techno doesn't let Phil help button it up, whacking his hands away to try doing it himself. It takes a moment, but he gets it, and Phil gives an appropriate smile when Techno looks up at him for a reaction. Techno smiles back when he realizes he gets to keep this shirt. After that, they grab some soft white socks, which Techno absolutely adores, kicking Phil in the gut a few times to get Phil to notice, as if Phil wasn't the one to put them on for him. The shoes, though, those weren't easy. Phil sat Techno down on a small wooden bench pushed against the wall, and he grabs a pair of boots that Emmy had brought along. Kneeling in front of the kid, he ignores the way Techno stares at the shoes with a face, and is relieved to find that they fit just fine, tugging them onto Techno's feet. Techno doesn't like it. "No, Techno, mate, shoes are important," Phil tries saying, holding Techno in his arms, Techno kicking his feet wildly to try and get the boots off, having quickly jumped off the bench to try throwing the boots off. He doesn't seem to mind Phil holding on to him, keeping him still. He just hates the boots. Emmy lingers in the doorway of the back room and watches with curious eyes as Techno gives something along the lines of a tantrum, except without the crying and screaming. He just won't stop kicking. "What if the ground gets too cold to walk on, or too hot? You need shoes to actually help," Phil says, keeping an arm around Techno, reaching down to Techno's leg to tug at one of the boots, which looks dangerously close to being kicked off. "No!" Techno says, half muffled in Phil's shirt. And Phil goes still, because that's the first word he's heard Techno even say, ever since he's picked him up from the nether. In his shock, Techno kicks a boot off, sending it flying away, hitting the wall before it lands on the ground with a thump. "No?" Phil repeats, grinning down at Techno, who makes a frustrated noise, trying to kick off the other boot. "No!" Techno says again, and nearly kicks the other boot off, Phil pulling it off for him instead, putting it to the side. Then Techno calms down, and seems content with leaning against Phil, still kicking his legs, but just absent-mindedly, rather than in a way of trying to get shoes off. He nods to himself, seeming content. No. Phil says fondly, tugging lightly at the small ponytail behind Techno's head. Techno whining. Why not? He waits for a response, Techno staring at him, before leaning forward and face-planting into Phil's shoulder, like that will make them move on. Technoblade. Phil snickers, gently pushing at Techno to sit back up. Why not? Do they not fit? Phil wonders if maybe Techno just isn't used to shoes, after being barefoot for so long. It makes sense if he would hate them then. There's a slim chance Techno ever tried on shoes over in the Nether. However, Phil just can't let Techno go without any, because if they're going to be moving, Techno needs to be walking. And while Techno hates the boots, Phil thinks that Techno would also hate having something poke him in the foot. Techno tries to hug Phil again, and Phil has to hold back a laugh at the look he gets in response at stopping him. Techno, acting as if Phil's committed treason, done something unthinkable. Mate, you can't just frown your way out of shoes, Phil says, Techno frowning even more intensely. Do you just not like shoes? I don't want 'em. Techno shakes his head, sentence coming out quick and mumbled, and Phil raises his eyebrows, not being able to stop the grin on his face. You don't want boots? Or just shoes in general? Phil asks, patient, reaching over to grab the boot he's put aside. The other shoe is still across the room, from Techno kicking it off. Techno makes a face, eyeing the boot in Phil's hand. You need shoes, Techno. No. I can't just carry you everywhere. Techno really frowns at that, scrunching his nose. Phil laughs quietly, smiling wide, and Techno stares at his face with a thoughtful look, then goes still as a bell rings out. Phil stills as well, eyes going wide as there's footsteps in the front of the shop. The bell ringing again as the door opens. Emmy is still by the doorway, and she glances to Phil, who wraps his arms and wings around Techno, eyes wide, nearly pleading. She walks out to the counter, Phil holding his breath. Techno is absolutely silent under him. Hello. This is the clothes shop, right? Yes, Emmy pauses, Phil looking around for anywhere to just run, but there isn't a back door over here. And if he wanted to get away with Techno, he would have to go through whoever just walked in. It's a matter if the lady is going to scream for help or not, and Phil slowly and quietly gets to his feet, Techno holding onto his neck. Phil keeps a hand on the knife at his side, staring at the doorway. You're at the right place. However, I regret to inform you we are closed. Phil feels the tiniest amount of relief in his chest, but he doesn't relax, still waiting for the worst scenario. He doesn't want to hurt anyone in order to get out, but that doesn't mean he'll hesitate. The door was open, though, the traveler asks, voice trailing off. Was it? Emmy says, voice full of false cheer, polite and chipper. Oh, I must have forgotten to lock it. But as you can see, I did close the curtains, and I was just in the back checking storage. Phil allows himself a small smile, happy to know he's being covered, and he makes a mental note to leave a tip for her kindness. I'll be quick, the traveler offers, Emmy laughing. You can be here in the morning, bright and early, and I'll be sure to sell you some deals then. However, I will need to ask you to go now. I do need to head home. Worth a shot. Thanks anyway. Mm-hmm. And there's the sound of footsteps and the bell of the door. Phil waits, and hears footsteps coming along again, Emmy appearing at the doorway, looking conflicted as she sees Phil. Standing in the middle of the small room, holding Techno in his arms, Techno barely visible under his feathers. He folds his wings back, rubbing a hand over Techno's back, giving a small smile. Thank you, Phil whispers, Emmy sighing. I don't know why I did that, she admits, leaning against the doorframe. I'm glad you did, either way, Phil says, putting Techno down. They move on from the tense moment, Phil having to coax Techno to put on his boots, coming to an agreement that Techno will put on the shoes just before they leave. But for now, as he goes through a pile of warm coats, he can just stay in his socks and be left to choose on which one he wants. Phil stands to the side, holding the small boots in his arms as Emmy stands beside him, staring at Techno, who's running his hands along the different types of coats laid out, making a face at a particularly scratchy one. You know, one day he's going to be dangerous. He's going to grow up, Emmy says, hesitantly, trying to warn Phil of what's to come. She sees Techno now, fussing with the fabric, rubbing his face against wool, and only sees potential for something that can become terrible. Phil sees differently. My heart won't be able to take that. I'll be thinking back on this, wishing he was small again. Imagining Techno grown up, taller than Phil, maybe, that kind of thought just makes him smile. Emmy turns her head to Techno again, crossing her arms. Techno's struggling to put on a jacket, and once he finally has his arms through the sleeves, he keeps it on for a solid 3 seconds, before deciding he doesn't like it, taking it off and throwing it to the ground. He's almost like a kid, Emmy quietly murmurs. He is a kid, full through. Phil nods, giving a bright grin to Techno when Techno looks up to him, pointing at the jacket on the floor, and then kicking it to the side. Phil gives a thumbs up in understanding. Techno moves on. He's a monster in the making. I don't know if you realize that, but you've signed yourself up for more than you can think of. Emmy turns her head to Phil, who only looks on at Techno. I signed myself up to take care of him, to protect him. Phil responds, voice calm. He's a threat to the world, Emmy whispers harshly, eyes glancing to Techno for a split second. Phil sighs, then turns his head to the woman, looking done. He's a kid who's been saddled with a bullshit prophecy and is being hunted down for simply existing. He's done nothing wrong. And if you're wrong? If one day he goes against you, snaps at you, what then? How are you going to defend him when he's killed and has blood on his hands? There's a reason his name is Blood God. And how Phil wishes it wasn't. He makes a mental note to keep the other 2 kids from being named anything along those lines. Techno's already processed his name, responds to it. Phil won't put him through the confusion and work of forcing a new name onto him. But for the other kids, he wants to get there soon enough so they don't have to have such a name that promises destruction. I don't think you get it, mate, Phil says, watching as Techno pokes around at a certain blue coat, eyes curious. It doesn't matter what he does. Anything that happens, either tomorrow or years from now, I'll still watch over him. I'm still going to love him. You're a little insane, Emmy says in response. Maybe, Phil admits, watching as Techno finds a coat that has fluffy wool on the inside of the hood, looking ecstatic. But I just know he doesn't deserve to be killed for simply existing. I'll raise him well, even if it means it'll end up in me being dead. Will you regret it then, after he's killed you? Emmy asks, almost bitterly. No. Phil smiles, Techno turning to him with a hood over his head, a new coat on. No, I won't regret it at all. They leave the shop soon after. New clothes, new boots, and Emmy giving them a half wave and some words before they go. I'll have to tell others of this in the morning. I didn't sell you out earlier because she says, standing by the door, the night sky full of stars over their heads. It's all right. I'll be long on my way by then. Phil nods, Techno in his arms, frowning at the fact he has shoes on. But he's happy with the coat he's picked out. And after Phil says his goodbyes, they're both off, flying into the sky. Phil's set to go as far as possible from the village, from where he found Techno. He needs to wait for Techno's reputation to simmer down, for people to eventually give up on finding him months later. He knows that he's going to end up in tales, stories passed from person to person, a winged traveler taking the kid meant to destroy them all, and taking it in as a son. Personally, he doesn't mind it. Finds it a bit funny, if anything. So he flies, off to another village far off, hoping to make it there and rest up, pass time traveling and exploring until the location of the next kid can be found out. The months pass rather quickly for Phil. They land in the village, find an inn to stay, Techno's face and hair hidden away under his hood, into Phil's shirt, and they spend the night in a proper bed, Techno stealing the pillow. They stay in the village for a little while, a few days. Phil talking with Techno, walking him through the town, letting him explore and see and learn. Phil's never been much of a teacher, and as much as he can try, he's not exactly the best at teaching Techno to read or write. But there's a library near the inn, and Techno runs his hands over the bookcases, flips through pages, not a clue on what they mean or what they say. Phil reads to him, reads story after story, night after night, and Techno listens on, never sleeping until Phil's finished the chapter. And even then, he still asks, quietly, sparingly. His words come more often, but he's still soft-spoken. For another one. One night, Phil complies, and he ends up reading all the way up to sunrise, passing out on the bed, waking up to Techno running his hands over the pages, trying to make sense of the letters for himself, since Phil won't do it for him. He goes to the librarian, then, who's a kind, sweet old lady, observes Phil's wings with a sad type of fascination, holding onto his arm as if Phil's gone through too much. Phil's been through plenty, but he's not too upset over it. She agrees to help Techno learn, and Techno is wary, refuses to sit by her, only with Phil. And they work it out in the first few weeks, the woman having to sit across the table, Phil sitting beside Techno as they work through letters. Technoblade picks it up fast, and seems determined to copy the librarian's neat handwriting exactly. She's a fancy type of writer, her letters curved and neat, pretty to look at, and Techno refuses to try writing any other way, trying again when he doesn't write an A the same way she does. Phil only smiles and watches in silence for those weeks, as Techno listens quietly to the lady, practices back at the inn, on the floor with papers all around, pencils scribbling away, writing the letters over and over, neat and curved. They move to reading, sounding out letters, and Techno goes from stumbling over sentences to quickly moving on to actual books. It becomes so that he reads Phil to sleep instead, Phil listening to Techno speak quietly, stutter over a word here and there, late at night. They stay in the town for over half a year, which turns into a whole year too quick, too fast for Phil, who watches Techno grow and learn, and eventually come out of his shell. He's still shy. That just seems to be his personality. Wary of anyone who isn't Phil. Careful around people he does know, like the kind old librarian, or the smiley baker who Phil always buys treats from. He's a quiet kid, to most, but he loves to ramble to Phil, late at night, asking and still grabbing at Phil's hair. He doesn't tug it, not anymore, but he sometimes attempts to braid it, like how Phil does with Techno's hair, always tying it back in a neat pink braid. Phil's had plenty of experience with hairstyles, so Techno's hair is always nice looking. And Technoblade insists on learning, and Phil lets him, guides him through it. They stay for a while in that town, and it makes a mark in Phil's heart, memories all around. He doesn't want to stay in place, wants to keep moving, wants to be wary. But this town is far, rather isolated, in the trees. And they don't have a priest or anyone with magic to tell of Technoblade's tale. The people know it, of course. They know of the blood god. It's been spread too far to not know it. But Techno is just the shy little kid who's always hugging Phil's legs whenever they linger in a shop. They're none the wiser. Techno needs somewhere to properly grow up, to learn, so Phil decides to live in the town for about 2 years. Techno growing up, learning. It's a temporary living space, and Phil knows it, because they will need to move on one day, for the next kid. Technoblade knows that much, has heard it from Phil before, of how he's not the only kid Phil needs to take care of. But for those 2 years, Technoblade stays content. A kid. Until the voices start. It's slow, at first. Techno seeming distracted during lessons, trailing off during reading, staring off into space when they're walking around town. Then it's unsettled sleep, waking up to Techno gripping onto Phil with a tight hug, crying quietly. Technoblade gets jumpy, becomes hesitant. And Phil asks over and over for Techno to tell him what's wrong. And Technoblade just stays silent, even when Phil's on his knees, holding onto Techno's hands with worried eyes. It's a whole 2 weeks, growing progressively worse, and Techno clings onto Phil, eyes wide in fear, still staring into space. And Phil tries his best to help, tries his best to hug him at night, sing quietly and try to lull the kid to sleep. He's not the best singer, but he knows small songs here and there. Techno enjoys them, at least, and it helps, just a little. Technoblade throws himself into reading, inhaling books at an unreasonable pace. And Phil can't seem to tear his eyes away from the words, and he decides to let Techno keep his nose stuck in a book, for at least it calms him down a little, makes him less unhappy. Then the hunters come, 2 weeks after the voices do, when Techno is just 8. Phil's in the bakery, talking with the people at the counter, debating to get maybe a small cake for Techno, who sits outside, a book in his hands. The bakery is a little loud, with the sound of people shuffling, ovens burning, and so Phil doesn't notice right away. He notices too late. Technoblade reads outside, sitting on the ground, as 2 new people walk into town and notice him. They're friendly, kind, and one kneels down to Techno to strike up a conversation, grinning brightly. He pulls Techno's book down, smiling warmly, then sees Techno's blood-red eyes, wide and slightly unhappy that he's been interrupted in his reading. A knife gets pulled, a book gets dropped, and Technoblade hears one of them mutter, "Blood God." His head is too loud, too quick, and he's being grabbed by the shirt, wanting to scream as his head explodes in chants. Too many voices to even process, and Phil turns as he hears screams, and his heart drops, quickly making his way outside, pushing the door open, grabbing his knife as soon as he sees Techno's book discarded on the ground, and he pauses, stays, lingering in front of the bakery, as screams sound out around them, the townspeople in shock. Oh. Phil breathes out, putting his knife back quickly. Oh no. Techno stands over 2 bodies, a bloody knife in his hand, tears streaming down his cheeks, and he's shaking so bad, a hand held to his head as he realizes what he's just done. He turns to Phil and drops the knife, shaking his head. Phil, I didn't mean to, Techno stammers. Phil rushing over, kneeling down, wrapping Techno up in his arms. They wanted blood. They kept wanting blood. I just wanted it to be quiet, Dad. I didn't... Phil's heart hurts at the dad stuttered out. And he looks at the damage around. The travelers looking to be killed quickly, cut across the throat. They probably didn't expect Techno to be so fierce. That ended in their demise, starting a fight with something they didn't know of. Who asked for blood? Phil asks quietly, pulling back, keeping his hands on Techno's shoulders. The townspeople are circling around now, realizing, becoming a threat. But Phil needs to know. I tried to stop. I tried to deny it. Techno sobs. Phil shushing him, holding a hand to his face. Who? He asks again. There's... Techno takes a shuddering breath in, hands in Phil's hair, smearing blood to them. Voices in my head. They just weren't being quiet, and I thought I had got it, but he had a knife, and it got so loud. It's all right. Phil reassures, pulling Techno into his arms again, getting to his feet, picking Techno up off the ground. It's all right now. Except it isn't, because there's 2 dead bodies on the ground, a bloody knife with them, and the people around them are starting to realize just who the blood god is. Phil, someone says, reaching a hand out. Look, your son, he's not who you... Stay back. Phil warns, taking a step backwards. Technoblade crying quietly into his neck, holding onto his hair. I know exactly who he is. You knew this would happen? Someone screams, angry, fearful. I thought that I could stop it, Phil thinks. But he doesn't say it aloud. He can't stop this. This is going to spread, going to cause more fear of Techno, is going to make life hell. He's going to work with it, Phil decides. Even with the added effort, if there are voices willing Techno to do this, then he's going to find a way to quell them. But the others won't care for that. No one cares for that. They only make steps towards Phil, carefully, caring, as if Phil didn't know his son would turn out like this. Phil's known all along, and he's not any less loving of the kid in his arms, nor any less protective. Listen, Phil, they say. Phil, raising his wings out, glancing around. Hand him over. I'm sorry. Stay back, Phil warns, and he pulls his knife, holding Techno close, holding the blade out in front of him. Stay back right now. You'll end up like them if you touch him. There's glances to the dead bodies on the ground, and Phil, for a second, feels remorse for their deaths. Then quickly moves on. They went after a child who was just reading peacefully on the ground. They pulled a knife on him. Phil doesn't care for that. He knows it's a bit fucked up, maybe. He doesn't care. Be rational, Phil, the baker says behind him. And Phil turns around, nearly screams as someone grabs at his arm, grabs for Techno, and he swipes the knife down, cutting into someone's arm. Don't you dare fucking touch him! Phil steps back, the crowd following. Leave him alone. You'll be sorry otherwise. Then he raises his wings out and flies before anyone else can make a grab for him. He flies away from the disaster that was and holds on to Techno, gritting his teeth as the kid lays silent in his arms. They land hours later, Techno quiet, still, as they land in a field, no one around for miles. Techno spaces off, and Phil brushes his hair back, carefully puts him down onto the grass. His hands are still covered in blood. It hurts Phil to see it. How's your head, Techno? Phil asks, kneeling down, and Techno takes a moment to respond, looking up with a distracted air to him. It wasn't enough, Techno says quietly, looking near tears again. They still want blood. They don't care whose. Phil, hush. Phil says gently, and reaches for his knife, pulling it out and trying to give it to Techno. Techno jolts back, like Phil's burnt him. No! Techno screams, falling back, scooting back as Phil walks towards him. No, I'm not. You're not gonna hurt me, Techno, Phil says, and he's fully sure of that. I'm not gonna make you hurt me. Techno stills, Phil reaching a hand out, and Phil pulls him back onto his feet, still flinching when a knife gets put into his hands. Phil turns him around, points the knife up, as if Techno is about to fight against the wind, and holds his arms around Techno, hand around his, as Techno nervously glances back at him. You have voices, right? In your head? Phil says quietly, by Techno's shoulder. Technoblade nods. They're loud. Technoblade admits, and he sounds so miserable. It makes Phil wish he could have helped sooner. Then quiet them. They want blood. Techno says, distastefully, grimacing. Do you want to give them that? Techno answers lightning quick. No. Phil raises the knife in Techno's hand, points it up at an invisible enemy. It's your head, your mind. Phil says, calm. So, quiet them. And he lets go, Techno taking a deep breath in. Then Techno lunges, swings, swipes like he's about to be killed, fighting against nothing, just the wind and air, and he fights in a way Phil didn't think he'd be able to with his size. It goes on for a while. Techno's screaming, sometimes nearly crying. Then he stops, stills, breathing heavily, staring off into the grass. And he runs to Phil, wrapping his arms around his neck, crying. Phil finds that the voices become quieter than they have been for the past 2 weeks. Chapter 5. Hiding in plain sight. They spend the night in the safety of a dark forest, a bed of leaves, but no fire. Phil doesn't want to risk the smoke giving them away. He's wary, and rightfully so. Technoblade sleeps against him like in the first days of when Phil found him, and he curls up against Phil to hide away from the night cold, Phil keeping him hidden under his wings. Phil doesn't sleep, but listens to Techno's quiet snores as he stares up into the stars, mind plagued with thought. Being surrounded by the townspeople like that, the chance of Techno being ripped away from him being too high, it was terrifying. Terrifying in a way Phil doesn't think he's ever felt. He's been alive for a long time. He's seen a lot. He's nearly died countless times. He's killed countless more. All those moments with his heart racing, him thinking, is this it? With wounds bleeding out, it was absolutely nothing compared to the horror of losing Technoblade. Especially when he was so vulnerable. He had been crying, broken in Phil's arms, and yet the townspeople had looked at Phil like he was given such a burden, having a child that's cursed. Looks of pity. Like Phil had no choice but to give his child up, because how could he keep a cursed child? Curse or not, Phil doesn't care. Prophecy come true or not, he doesn't care. Fear crawls up his throat and chokes him as he holds Techno tight. And it's not fear over Technoblade becoming exactly what everyone warns of. He should be scared of that. He should be wary. He should be thinking of the greater good. Technoblade shows potential to kill, to hurt, and he should be terrified of the possibility of the kid in his arms one day turning against him. But all he can feel is desperation, and he finds that he'd rather watch the entire world burn, with him in it too, rather than give this child over in his arms. All he can feel is fear of being ripped away and having no say on if Techno gets to live. And he promises over and over in his head, to the skies to gods he knows are out there, please, please don't let that happen. But even with all the pleas in the world, Phil knows for a fact that tears and begging aren't a sure way to protect something. So he makes a different promise. And he holds Techno close that night, mind thinking of him and of the other 2 kids that need just as much help as Techno. And he promises that he will not let the world kill them. And if the world refuses and continues to try and hurt them, then Phil will resort to the violence they crave. He doesn't enjoy killing. He would rather pick mercy than go through with having to take a life with his hands. But he'll easily do it if he has to. If he has to, then he can kill 100 men. If he has to, he will kill 100 more. It's too late to think about the things he will do for his kid, and for the other children to come. And so he holds Technoblade close to his chest, hearing him mumble something quietly in his sleep, and tries to think about something else. His mind wanders to the next child. The town Phil was in had been bliss, growing and having a nice, calm life for what felt like so long. But even with the growth it gave, and even with the safety it held, fear stabs into Phil's heart, and he wonders if he's too late. He hasn't heard about the next child for the prophecy. There aren't any priests in that village. There weren't any magic users, any monsters. Travelers would come and go, but never brought tales like that with them. It was a blessing, at first, having an escape from it, keeping the prophecy away. But now Phil feels like an idiot, because what if he's too late? He needs to find them. Quickly. Soon. Technoblade still needs to learn how to deal with the voices in his head, with the demand for blood that plagues him. But Phil can multitask. He can help Techno and search. They can learn on the way. Phil pauses for a second, and wonders when exactly he became so set on becoming a father. That revelation is somehow more crushing than everything else. And it's not entirely in a bad way, but it makes him feel like crying and being emotional. So he closes his eyes to try and get some rest. He opens his eyes to daylight, and he wakes up to Techno holding onto his hair, already awake, head resting on Phil's chest as he stares off into the trees, seeming bored but content. Phil smiles, then quickly sits up, scooping Techno up in his arms and ignoring the shriek of surprise that comes with it. Instead, just hugging Techno with a grin, pressing a kiss into his hair. "Wait, what?" Techno stammers out, Phil wrapping his wings around him, drowning him in feathers as he hugs him tight. "Phil, you're squishing me." "I know," Phil mumbles, Techno letting out a huff against his shirt. "Good morning." Techno makes a noise that sounds somewhere in between annoyed and confused. "Why are you squishing me? Can't I just hug my son?" Phil asks, lightheartedly. And he can feel Techno freeze. And Phil knows for a fact he's gone embarrassed with that. "I guess," Techno mumbles out, shoving his face into Phil's shirt. "Then I will hug you." Phil nods, leaning back from where he's sitting. "It's going to be busy for the next few weeks." "Why?" Phil hesitates, flipping thoughts over in his head, trying to think of a proper way to approach this. Techno knows that he's hunted. He knows that people want to kill him because they think he's dangerous, but he doesn't know the entire picture. Phil's told him about being wary, about being careful, but he hasn't been told about the fact that he's not the only one. It hurts Phil a little to know the fact that Techno is perfectly aware as to why that attack happened yesterday, and he knows Techno understands that he's not like all the other people they've ever met. "Phil?" Techno asks, Phil finding that he's been quiet for too long, and he lets out a quiet sigh, folding back his wings behind him. We need to go find someone. Phil starts, Techno waiting for him to go on. You know why you were attacked yesterday, right? Because I'm dangerous? Techno guesses, not sounding entirely upset over it. You are dangerous, I'll be honest about that. Phil says, Techno snorting. I have voices in my head that demand blood. He deadpans. And Phil has to blink down at him for a second, as Techno just blinks back with a bored expression. They're a lot more quiet now, so I'm going to make fun of them. You do that. Phil grins, scoffing. Sounds like a good way to make them stay quiet. It's better than, well... Techno falters, gaze drifting off. Fighting? I don't want to do that. Phil hums, and he thinks of the knife that stays on his hip. You can practice with a weapon if it helps. I could get you a proper one at the next town. Then you'll have a way to protect yourself from any repeats of yesterday and from the voices as well. I can't do that. Techno frowns, shaking his head. That's not... I don't want to... He pauses, stares intensely into Phil's shoulder. Why not? Because... Techno stops again, taking a deep breath in. Because what if I hurt you? Techno looks at him with such worried eyes, bright red and caring, and Phil's heart squeezes. Techno goes on. Back at the town, I wasn't even thinking. I didn't know what happened, but he grabbed me, and it's like everything started screaming. He shakes his head, gritting his teeth. And I just wanted it to be quiet, and I just didn't want to get killed, so it's all right. Phil reminds. Techno blinking quickly, taking deep breaths. It's okay. No, it's not! Techno yells. Phil raising his eyebrows. I don't care about the fact I killed them. I couldn't care less about them. What about you? Phil feels like his air has been taken from his lungs, and he takes a steady intake of air, trying to give an example to Techno of what to follow. Deep, calming breaths. You're not going to hurt me, Phil says carefully, Techno's face scrunching up in distress. You don't know that! I do. Phil nods, and he wipes a thumb right under Techno's eye. Techno, huffing, as to try not getting worked up even more. I know you don't want to hurt me, so I know you'll do everything to assure that it won't get that bad again. Techno lowers his eyes to the necklace around Phil's neck, usually tucked away under the layers of his clothes, but it sits out in the open now, faintly glowing. It was too loud, Techno mumbles, and Phil wonders how Techno dealt with it for those weeks. How he tried distracting himself, tried keeping himself busy so he didn't have to listen to the words in his head. Constant and insisting. Phil wishes he could force them to stop. But that's up to Techno. But it's better now? Phil asks, Techno nodding. After you had fought in the field? It's not blood, but they'll take it. Techno mutters, huffing. They just want fighting. Then we can work with that, Phil says. Techno making a face. You can handle a weapon of your own? I know I'll still be safe. Techno looks to the forest floor, staring at a stray leaf on the ground. Do you think you could work with that? Phil asks, waiting. Techno doesn't respond for a moment, seeming to turn the idea over in his head, before settling on a realization, then nodding. Okay, I can do that. Phil blinks at the sudden mood shift, Techno going from hesitant and upset to purely determined. Okay? Yep. Techno nods, rolling off of Phil, going to get to his feet. Phil just looks up at Techno with an amused smile, and shakes his head. All right, We better get going. Who are we looking for? Techno asks, as Phil stands up, stretching his wings out with a yawn. You said we're looking for someone. Why? You are Technoblade, the ever-so-feared blood god. Phil starts, voice laced with sarcasm, and he then goes to poke Techno in the sides, Techno choking on a squeal, struggling to get away as Phil grins and grabs him. Who also likes soft things and gold coins. What about it? Techno defends, taking several steps away, holding his hands out and getting into a stance, as if ready to run if Phil tries to poke him again. You're the first of 3 of a certain prophecy, Phil says, and he hesitates, then goes on. That's why people are so scared of you, and that's why they tried killing you yesterday. Everyone wants to kill me because of a dumb prophecy, Technoblade asks, not looking amused. What prophecy? Phil clasps his hands together, holding them in front of his mouth. Before you were born, every single priest, magic user, anyone who had a way to know about legends and all that. Legend like the Ender Dragon? Techno asks. That's a legend. He had read about it in the library before. He's read everything he could get his hands on about that. A whole dragon in the world different from theirs. It was so cool. Yes, they all heard about a new story with some new creatures. 3 monster hybrids meant to grow up and destroy the entire world as we know it. Phil says quickly, trying to put it all in one blow. You're the first one out of 3. Techno stares at him, blinks. Eh? He only says, and Phil can't hold back the laugh. Why would I do that? That would take so much effort. Sure, my head is all yelling for blood and death, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna kill everyone. I know. Phil snickers, Techno frowning. But that's why you have to be careful. And that's why we need to go searching for the next kid. I've been waiting too long, and everyone knows about them. They could be in danger. And what do we do when we find them? Help them. Phil says, easily. Like I help you. Techno seems to think it over, frowning at the ground. But then he nods, slowly. I guess. They go to move across the land, finding a dirt path and following it until they hit a new town, bigger, more livelier than the one they've been staying at for the past few years. Phil decides to carry Techno as they walk in, and Techno keeps a hood over his head, his face tucked into Phil's shoulder as he goes down the street. Phil is confident enough that no one will recognize him by his wings alone, but he knows it's just a matter of time until people realize he's the one who's run off with Technoblade. So, he needs to enjoy the anonymity while he still can. Techno stays hidden in Phil's arms, and it's not suspicious, someone holding a sleeping kid in their arms. There's people scattered around the street as Phil makes his way through it, hearing passing conversations, a few shop owners yelling out deals. And Techno tightens his grip onto Phil's collar, huffing. He's nervous, and Phil understands. New people, new risks. And he knows Techno doesn't want a repeat of yesterday, wary of anyone who turns their head to them both. Phil keeps a steadying hand on his back and a friendly smile as he walks. Some people giving knowing looks, parents of their own kids. Phil has a feeling they wouldn't be looking so kind if they knew exactly what type of kid Techno was, though. Walking past multiple shops, Phil makes his way to a blacksmith, pushing open the door and feeling a wave of heat from inside. He makes a face at the hot air that circles around him. But Techno raises his head with an intrigued look. And there's a stray thought in Phil's mind on if Techno misses the nether from time to time. Maybe not. He probably would have been too young to really know it past the heat of that realm. It's mostly empty inside, thankfully. Only a couple off to the side, who seem lost in their own world as they talk to each other. The walls are lined with plenty of weapons, swords, axes, knives, but also just normal tools. A storage of pickaxes put to the side. A crate of what might be iron bars or something along those lines tucked in the corner, beside the counter made of stone. Phil puts Techno down onto the ground, and Techno holds onto his hand, turning his head around to take in the new environment, narrowing his eyes at the people off to the side. He looks up at Phil with almost a frown, and Phil just smiles back. It'll be quick, Phil promises, tugging Techno along as he walks over to the counter, making his way around a table in the middle of the room that holds multiple tools on display. The blacksmith is a smiley young woman with pitch-black hair tied back and a friendly voice that greets Phil as soon as he walks close enough. "Welcome! I didn't hear the front door ring. Give me a sec," she calls out. And as Techno leans into Phil's leg, she goes to run off into the back room, the sound of something clanging and smashing as she curses. There's a minute of commotion, and she comes back out, circling around the counter, placing her hands onto the stone with a grin. "Hey, how are you, and what do you—" she goes to say, and pauses at the sight of Phil's wings on his back. Phil takes a deep breath in at the sparkle of awe in her eyes, and nearly jumps when she slams her hands down on the counter again, leaning to the side and trying to get a better look. "Holy fuck, wings! You have wings! I've never seen those before, wow!" Phil chuckles, smiling. "Had them my whole life," he responds, a bit sarcastic. Yeah, sorry, that's probably rude of me, I'm just..." She waves her hands. "Wings? Oh, that's so cool. Moving on, what do you need?" "We're here for swords, mainly. Just some simple ones, so we can get back on the road with protection." "We?" she asks, leaning forward on the counter, and as she does, Techno takes a step back to hide into Phil's wings. "Oh, fuck, a kid. Oh, shit, wait, oh!" She slaps a hand over her mouth, laughing behind it. "Sorry, I shouldn't swear in front of a little one. I don't usually get young kids here with weapons in the vicinity and all." She tries leaning even more over the counter to get a better look at Techno, who keeps himself tucked away behind Phil, just out of sight. "Hey, little guy." Techno tugs at the back of Phil's shirt, not giving a response. "He's shy," Phil offers, and she nods, giving a toothy grin. "He's not really fond of strangers, sorry." No, makes sense. He'll grow out of his shell, don't worry about it," she reassures Phil, leaning back. "Just don't go letting him repeat what I say. I say stupid shit all the time." She winces. "I'm not the best with kids." "It's all right," Phil snickers. I'll just give you a discount as an apology for swearing in front of your kid. What are you here for again? Swords? You want a custom-made one? Place an order?" Phil thinks, turning her question over in his head as he looks across the walls, at the amount of plain swords hanging up, leaning against the wall. "I'll need one, but what I'm really concerned with is his." He points a finger behind him to Techno. "A sword for the little one? Really now?" She raises her eyebrows, trying to get a good look on Techno again, only for Techno to stay in Phil's wings. I mean, then again, with proper guidance, a little bit of fighting never hurt anybody. Well, it does hurt, actually. It's fighting. Okay, I need to ask, are you sure? Phil holds back a snort. "I thought it would be nice for him to learn, so he can use it as a hobby and for defense when he grows up." "Yeah, that makes sense. All right. I'm not judging your parenting skills. You probably know your kid." She shrugs, walking around the corner, making her way to the wall of swords. "I'm not sure if I got a small enough one for him. I got all of these. You can pick one out, by the way. Go ahead, browse. Although he's not going to be able to carry these comfortably. She looks up and down the wall, scanning the different blades as Phil slowly walks over to look through the weapons like she suggested, Techno grabbing his hand again. He leans into Phil's side, eyes looking curiously at all the metal woven into sharp blades in front of him. "What do you think, Tech?" Phil murmurs, Techno turning his head up as he looks to the swords placed higher up. Anything that looks good enough for me to use? Techno glances up to Phil's face for a moment, before looking back at the wall, tilting his head as he seems to actually look for one. I'm going to check the back. Give me a sec, the blacksmith calls out, jogging over to the back room for something that would suit Technoblade. As she's busy, Techno tugs Phil to the side, searching for the perfect sword, and Phil just waits patiently. He could probably use any of these, to be honest, save for the heavy ones, but he wants to see what Techno will pick. After a moment, he seems to find it, and he points a finger at one that sits just out of his reach, and Phil looks at it, then laughs, going to take it off the wall. This one? Phil asks, holding it in his hand. A simple sword with a gold hilt, a tiny emerald in the center of it. Don't tell me you picked this just 'cause it's golden. Techno has the decency to look a bit sheepish, tugging at Phil's hand. No. No? The, green matches your shirt. Techno nods, Phil snickering. The emerald, mate? Phil asks, and points the tip of the sword into the ground so Techno can get a look. Yeah. Techno agrees, poking at the gem, then raising his eyes up to Phil again with an expectant face. Phil shrugs, smiling. Sure, it's a good choice. Techno beams. I'm back, Phil hears, turning his head to the woman again, and she holds 3 different swords in her arms, kneeling down to the ground in front of Techno and laying them out. I got some choices here, look. Techno takes a step back into Phil, hands grasping onto the end of his shirt, and he gives a nudge to Techno for him to go ahead and pick. Techno glances up at him, before looking back down, eyes observing the smaller swords in front of him. They're a bit thinner, lighter, no doubt, and it might still take a bit for Techno to get used to them, but they seem good. Made these a little while back. They've been collecting dust. I won't lie, I forgot about them in the corner of the workbench. But go ahead. Pick one out, little one, whichever you think is best. The blacksmith grins, leaning back on her knees, holding her palms out. Technoblade just stares at them, tugging at Phil's shirt again. You pick, he says quietly, Phil barely catching it. It's your sword, mate. Phil nudges him in the shoulder to go on. I picked yours, you pick mine. Techno insists, narrowing his eyes up at Phil, and Phil gives a long, fond sigh. All right. He looks down to the swords on the ground, taking less than a minute to really make a choice. Grab the middle one. Techno picks it up, giving a wary glance to the blacksmith, who sits not too far, taking a step back at Phil's side as quick as he can, before holding it up and looking at it. It might still be a little heavy, sorry for that, but you'll get strong, won't you? The blacksmith asks, leaning forward with a smile, and Techno goes to hide into Phil's wings again, only for Phil to take a step to the side, Techno giving an absolute betrayed face. Is it good? Phil asks, Techno holding the sword upside down, the handle to his chest as he frowns at Phil for stepping away. Mm-hmm. He only gives as an answer, then actually nods. Chatty, aren't you? The blacksmith asks, Techno keeping his head down on his boots, like they're the most interesting thing in the world. Don't worry, little one, you'll grow into it. How much? Phil asks for the price, taking the swords from Techno as Techno goes to stand behind him, hands grabbing at his feathers. How much you got? She responds, raising her eyebrows, only to laugh. I'm kidding. 10 gold sounds like fair trade. Phil reaches into his pocket to hand over the change, and as he does, Techno pokes his head out, hand swiping out at Phil's sleeve. Can I have one? He whispers, Phil turning his head to him with a smile. Will I get it back? Phil asks, Techno making a face, before nodding. All right. And he gives a coin over to Techno, who holds it to his chest, looking happy. A few minutes later, they're off, new weapons at their sides, and a general pleasant interaction. Phil walks down the street to go to the church that he can see from here, tall and made of stone. There's bound to be information there from the priest, over the next kid, and Phil tries to keep the nervous feeling in his chest down at whatever he might hear. Techno walks at his side, holding onto Phil's hand with one hand and holding his gold coin with the other, eyes glancing up carefully as he looks around the street. Phil notes that Techno is going to be seeing quite a lot, for at least the next few months, with them having to stay traveling for the next two kids, and for safety. It could get dangerous, being on the run, and Phil promises to help Techno learn how to use that sword that stays on his hip. There's a bell that rings at the top of the church, over and over, loud and chiming, and Phil raises his head to it, humming under his breath. He wonders what time it is, how much time he has until news of yesterday reaches this town, and then the next, and the next, until Phil makes a name for himself. Techno is recognizable, he knows that, but Phil not so much. But with his wings, and with the incident from those hunters, Phil knows his face will be well known soon. They walk up to the church, Phil aiming to get to the wooden doors, but he's stopped as Techno pauses in his steps, his hand almost slipping out of Phil's. Phil turns around, hearing the clink of a coin falling, and he sees the gleam of gold at Techno's feet, Techno paying no mind to it. "Tech?" Phil asks, his eyesight following Techno's, to the wall of the church, where there are a few flyers put up, hanging and occasionally fluttering with the winds, their words out for anyone to see. Phil's heart drops as he realizes what Techno is looking at. "Is that who we're looking for?" Techno asks, quietly, as he stares at a wanted poster, a messy drawing of something not quite human on it, something deadly, the features over-dramatic and scary. Phil knows right away there's no possible way that's how they actually look. It's too artificial, too warped under the influence of someone's fear. "Second monster destined to cause apocalypse," it says in big, bold letters at the top. Phil, feeling like the words are getting burned into his heart, as he squeezes Techno's hand in a way he hopes is comforting. "Wanted, dead or alive,